Well, thank you very much, Bill, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. As Bill said, with this very long history of my career, I think my job here is to stand back and look at the big picture and set what we've all been hearing about this morning in the global context. So I called it the long view. I'm going to talk about a number of trends, and I'm going to do it with the help of some of the wonderful cover illustrations from The Economist, as you can see here. And towards the end, I'm going to hone back into the US economy and the more immediate question that you've been discussing a little bit earlier on about the risks and the opportunities of what is the world's biggest economy. So I don't need to tell you we live in turbulent times. This is sort of buckle up time for the world in a number of areas. We have wars. Thankfully, we have a ceasefire at the moment, but a fragile one in the Middle East, but we still have war in Ukraine. We have wars elsewhere. We're in a renewed period of geopolitical rivalry, and as you've been hearing today, an extraordinary technological upheaval. And I think that it helps in trying to navigate all this to sort of step back and look at the deep underlying forces that are really driving a lot of this upheaval. And it's crucial to know that it's not just Trump. You may think it's just Trump if you pick up the paper every day or you look at your newsfeed every day, but mega change, as I call it, runs a lot deeper than that. And I'm going to talk about a few of these big trends, and I hope that's helpful for you in the future to try to put the day-to-day in perspective. So, first mega trend, if you like, war and peace. We're moving away from the world order that was prevailed for so long after the Second World War. Geopolitics is back with a vengeance, you could say. The old order is crumbling, and we've yet to see really crystallize quite what the new order is that's going to take its place. We know a few things about it, but it's still in flux. I think the one event that really illustrated this was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was a taboo-busting event. That means that nobody can be quite sure in future whether borders are going to be safe in future. It immediately throws a spotlight as well on another potential conflict between Taiwan and mainland China. That's why China is watching very closely what's happening in Ukraine, and as soon as you start talking about whatever the outcome is going to be in Ukraine, people think, well, what are the implications for Taiwan and China? Another huge implication is what happens to the arms control environment in the world. And we've got lucky broadly so far since the first atomic bomb was dropped at the end of the Second World War. Lucky in that nuclear proliferation has been not entirely contained, as you know. We have a couple of new nuclear powers, but it's been broadly contained. And we're really entering into a period where there's going to be, one way or another, a new nuclear arms buildup. We see China expanding its arsenal very rapidly. We see Russia and America abandoning now all the arms control treaties that they had. And we have an American nuclear umbrella which is less secure than it has been in the past for both European allies and Asian allies. So you have, perhaps slowly but surely, the question of, do we need nukes too, cropping up in a number of other areas as well. So sadly, I think this is something that we're going to have to think about and worry about in the years ahead, is who is going to get the bomb, basically, who might think of getting the bomb. So it's a much less stable geopolitical environment than we've had before. We have the grand rivalry between China and America as being the two real superpowers. Russia is a superpower, but it is a superpower in the weapon sense, not in an economic sense. America and China are the real deal in terms of being economic and military superpowers. Here you have a chart of the conflicts that are involved as one of the participants, at least, a state, and you can see that it's been going up really to historical highs. It shows that this is an increasingly complex and conflict-ridden world that we're in. So this is the worst bit. This is the bad news I'm getting over now. We're going to get more cheerful as we go ahead. Second mega trend, and it's linked to the first, of course. We're in a new economic order where America is still the extraordinary powerhouse of the world, but China is, of course, it's near or in some cases absolute peer in a number of areas. So there's this broad rivalry between America and China, which is playing out in industry after industry. And that is, I think, part of the big picture that we're going to be living with now for decades ahead, is this US-China competition rivalry. It's a complicated rivalry, as we've seen in recent times with the trade brinkmanship between the two countries, but it's a reality. I want to emphasize also that one shouldn't forget some of the other, if you like, secondary powers, the middle powers, I've called them there. If you look at tables of growth around the world, you will see that countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, a really interesting test case right now with the reforms that Javier Milei is introducing there. Saudi Arabia, a lot of you will be from the region of the Gulf region, you know how dynamic the developments are there. And then there's another huge economy, which is India. India is definitely on the rise, but it comes from a much lower base than China. I'll talk a little bit more about India in a bit. But there is a question, there should be a question mark at the bottom there. Will China eventually overtake America to be the #1 economy in the world? It depends a bit on how you measure it, whether you use current exchange rates or what's called purchasing power parity. By purchasing power parity on some measures, China may already be bigger, but the real one that counts is current exchange rates. And interestingly, here's a chart that's a couple of years old now, but I think it's really interesting. One forecast which suggests that China may never actually quite get to the point that it overtakes America. Until relatively recently, I think the assumption was because China is so populous, growing so fast, it was just bound to overtake America at some point in the near future. And the question was, well, would it be by 2030? Would it be by 2035? This is an interesting chart, and of course all forecasts are uncertain, but it suggests that actually it may get close, but it may not actually ever quite get there. Reason being, something else I'm going to talk about, China is finding growth harder to come by as its population ages and as it has to eke out more and more growth through productivity. So, but I think the bigger picture is they're very close. They're really, you can see there, they're going to be very, very close, near peer rivals, and that is the big picture for the world in the years to come. Third big theme, and this is one that I think one can never quite get enough of, which is demography, population trends. These are so important. They're slow moving, you don't see them day to day, but over time they have an absolutely enormous importance and impact on the way the world works and on the changing structures of both the economy and of power. So just to give you a scale of this, order of magnitude, right? It took the entire history of mankind until about 1800 for the world's population to reach 1 billion people. So the first time that the world passed that landmark of 1 billion people was only in around 1800. All of human history before the world's population, human population, was below that. The latest extra additional 1 billion people, from 7 billion to 8 billion, took about a dozen years. So what took the entire history of humanity till 1800 happened within a dozen years of putting on an extra billion people. So that gives you a sense of the pace at which change is happening. And it's not just the overall numbers of population that matter, it's the structure of population, where that population is happening, what the age profile of different countries is in different regions. So very broadly, fertility rates are coming down across the world. Women are having fewer children. That's true regardless of religion, regardless of culture. It is, you would think Catholic countries, for example, would tend to have higher birth rates because there is a religious opposition to birth control, but some of the countries with the lowest fertility rates are in fact Catholic countries. And you would think that it would happen beyond a certain point in emerging countries, that they would keep growing very fast in terms of population. Turns out that as they get richer, their fertility rates go down too. So you broadly have three different groups of countries around the world. You have certain countries which have had and continue to have very low birth rates, and where the population is aging very rapidly. And they are countries like Japan, you will know this, aging society, very low birth rates. In my continent of Europe, places like Italy, similar story. And crucially, also China, very rapidly aging society. China's workforce has stopped growing, working age population has stopped growing. It's actually shrinking. So China has to eke out its growth in future from higher productivity. And then you have a sort of mid-tier of countries which have middling population growth, are still relatively dynamic, but are also aging. The United States would be one of those countries. And then you have the countries that are extremely young and dynamic in terms of their population. And critically, India is one of those countries, and a lot of Africa would be in that group. So a lot of the future young people in the world are actually going to be in the continent of Africa. The future of the planet, if you like, will, in a very literal sense, depend quite heavily on what happens to Africa and these very large numbers of people who are going to be coming into the working age population. Is there sufficiently dynamic economies close to them to absorb that labour force, in which case it's a fantastic opportunity? Or are they going to be migrating in very large numbers in search of work? So just perhaps one more comparison to show you how this changed. When I was born, 1950s, Europe was about 20% of the world's population. Africa, together, about half that. That's completely reversed. By 2050, Europe is going to be well below 10%, Africa 20% in climate. So it just shows you what extraordinary changes we're seeing taking place in the world. And I just want to focus on one comparison, which is India v. China. So this shows you the demography, the demographic picture of those two giant economies. And you can see that just a couple of years ago, India actually overtook China as the most populous country in the world. I mean, small numbers and being number one is not terribly important other than for psychological reasons, but it's a significant moment. Perhaps more significant is that India is going to continue to grow. You can see that Indian mountain getting higher and higher as China starts to shrink. And the age profile, as I mentioned, India, the bottom tiers of that population stack, the younger population, much bigger than the China one. So that explains just right there why you would expect year in, year out now for the coming years, India to be growing at a faster pace than China, because there are more people coming into the Indian working age population. And assuming they can find jobs, that's going to mean faster, higher growth. They're also coming from a much lower base, so they have more catch up to do. And I just perhaps show you this last slide on demography as well. This shows you how over time, if you project right forward, the long-range projections of population growth can vary enormously. The top line there is the UN baseline population growth, which shows that the world's population keeps on growing to over 10 billion towards the end of the 21st century. But that depends crucially on some rather large assumptions about what happens in future to fertility rates. And it's assuming that fertility rates kind of revert back to a slightly higher level than they have fallen to in recent times. And that very large assumption could be wrong. You only have to tweak it a little bit, and then you get the other lines on this chart, which shows if you reduce the assumptions of how quickly that recovery of fertility rates happens, you get population peaking much earlier and in fact falling in the lowest of these ranges to about 8 billion, back down to 8 billion by the end of the century. Still a very large population on the planet, but these are huge differences. And I suspect that the UN baseline is probably too high, and that we're going to go back slightly lower than that. So again, if you're interested in long range planning of the world and of population sizes, pay a lot of attention to those crucial assumptions. Don't take UN baselines as gospel truth. So the fourth very big theme is what's happening to world trade, global trading blocks. And I like this image that we had on the cover of The Economist a few years ago, because I think it shows that things have got a lot more complex than they used to be. And it's become a kind of Rubik's Cube of global trading arrangements. So it used to be that it was assumed that we were on a kind of inevitable path towards more and more and perhaps even faster globalization. I guess China joining the World Trade Organization was a major landmark in this, reconnecting or connecting that vast market and its supply chains into the world economy. And what's happened, as you well know recently, is that has started to be questioned. We have all sorts of trade tensions, and we are in a slightly different world. Now, what is this different world? We one moment called it globalization becomes slowbalization. So it was still globalization, but happening more slowly. I tend to think of it more of a sort of transactional transnationalism right now. I don't think we're going into a completely isolationist world. I mean, look at this room. This is a very global, we're talking about global business arrangements. Walton is a brilliant example of that. But it's a more complicated situation than we've had for a long time, where countries are tending to trade more openly with other countries that they trust, and to be wary of geopolitical rivals. And that obviously particularly pertains to China and the United States, where we have a little bit of a truce at the moment, but who knows how long that truce will last. Even between Canada and the United States, you could hardly imagine two closer trading partners. But Mark Carney, the Canada's minister, recently said in an interview with us, for decades we had this deepening relationship between Canada and the United States. That assumption, that era is over. We're in a different world, and Canada is now very actively looking at deepening its trading relationships with other trading blocs, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, but also European Union, to give more stability to its trading situation. Doesn't mean it's turning its back on America. It's far too big a market for that. but it's a more complicated situation than we were in before. So I think we're into a situation where we have lots of smaller trading arrangements that together make this global trading system kind of fit together like a Rubik's cube. And here you can see again, these long-run charts are so fascinating that since the 1930s, where tariffs peaked after the Smoot-Hawley Act in the United States, they came steadily down and down and down and down. And then you have Donald Trump, and tariffs have gone leaping up, bouncing around because the Liberation Day tariffs were announced, but then as deal after deal gets done and exceptions get made, they come a bit back down again. But they're going to settle down considerably higher than where the baseline was before this all started. So you have a world trading system that has more barriers than it had before. Fifth big theme is the environment, global warming, climate change, and so on. And we're just a week away. Next week, the latest COP conference gets underway in Brazil, and the predictions are from the UN that the 1.5% rise in temperatures that was hoped for over pre-industrial levels is really not really attainable anymore. The prediction there is it's going to be closer to 2.8 degrees centigrade rather than 1.5, and that there is, I think, around the world, it's fair to say, what we call here on this cover a green lash against, if you like, some of the more extreme climate actions that have been taken. Most obvious example of that is, again, the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Agreement now twice, once under Trump 1, now again under Trump 2. But you also see this green lash happening in a lot of other countries. In Germany, for example, rebellions against the very aggressive requirements to have heat pumps. In the UK, my own country, you have questioning of whether the net zero targets by the government are realistic and wise, given some of the implications that they're having for energy costs in the UK. And this is sort of repeated, I think, in many parts of the world. So there is, I think, we've become pulled back globally from the most dramatic climate policies. But that said, there's a lot of momentum still behind this. First of all, there's real stuff happening. There's severe weather events happening again and again around the world which are concentrating minds. There's public opinion, particularly among young people, which demands action. Consumers demand action. There's a global competition in this area too. So China is again positioning itself to be a global climate leader, particularly since America may be ceding that territory to some extent. But even in America, you have a lot of dynamism behind the green technology businesses, and even in places where you might think that was implausible, like Texas, a lot of green technology and a lot of business to be had there. So there is technology happening, there is cultural shifts underway, and there is also the whole question of adapting to climate change, even if you can't absolutely prevent it to the extent that many people would like to see happen. So climate change is happening. There's going to be a lot of investment going to have to happen into the adaptation to a warmer planet. Here's a chart again which shows how the world has changed. This is the oil intensity of production around the world, of GDP. So the barrels of oil consumed per $1,000 of GDP, and you can see that the trend right around the world in region after region has been steadily down, and very dramatically so in China's case. So the world is using less of the black stuff to get an extra unit of GDP out. That's a very important trend. You may also have seen in the news that very recently it was announced that in the first half of this year, for the first time ever, renewable sources of electricity collectively overtook coal-generated electricity globally. So again, that's a pretty significant landmark. So despite the green lash that I was talking about, there is nevertheless a lot happening in the climate space, and this is one of the, I think, secular deep trends, both in terms of the green technology that is being developed and which is a competitive space, and in terms of adaptation to climate change. And it's relevant again to when we talk about AI and what the net effect of AI is going to be, because it promises these huge efficiencies. It's part of the story of climate efficiency, but it's also, as we've heard, very power hungry to have the data centers that enable AI to happen. And that leads to my sixth, and perhaps one of the most important themes in all of this, is this extraordinary period of technology change that we're in at the moment. I love this cover of The Economist because it sort of says so clearly with AI the two faces of it. And I think a lot of people are very torn about what to think, what to make of it. Is it the devil shaking up our world and possibly being exploited by by bad actors in various ways. Scam artists, fraudsters, state actors that may be using it for nefarious purposes, or even AIs that become so powerful that they start to take over human activity in a serious way? Or is it saintly, the solution to so many of our problems, the answer to efficiency that we need for climate change, the answer to all sorts of productivity problems that the world faces, the provider of solutions in every sort of industry that is going to drive productivity and growth? So I think that's the jury is still out in many of these areas, and some of the people who are most concerned are some of the people who are actually most closely involved with AI, but you can't stop the race. The race is on. It's again part of this geopolitical rivalry between America and China to be the leaders in this area. And as we've heard, the most extraordinary investments are being made in this area. Historical levels of activity, particularly in the United States, to position the country to be the leader in AI. A lot of questions about what happens to jobs in the new world in the AI economy. We heard, it was fascinating to hear about Walton thinking about this and the idea that jobs, it's going to enable basically productivity growth because you can get more value out of the same number of employees. And I think that's probably going to be a story repeated across industry after industry. In some cases, it's going to also be replacing people, but oftentimes it's just going to be enabling people to do more with the same labor, amount of labor, but those people are going to be doing different jobs. And when people start to think about the impact on the labor force of AI, I think what's important is to remember that the world doesn't stand still. What people do for jobs is not a fixed thing. It changes. So it may probably will remove whole categories of workforce, but it will create whole other categories. So a lot of upheaval. We just have to try and be imaginative enough to think of the sorts of jobs that are going to be created in future by AI. And already in previous waves of technology, you can see that there are whole categories of work that didn't exist before that now exist because of new technology, whether it be internet technology, coding, and so on, drone operators, you name it. Whole economies that didn't exist before suddenly created. We need to imagine what the new machine-human interactive economy is going to create in terms of jobs. There will be uses for this labor. It will be very much a lot of churn, but people are not going to be doing nothing. So I suppose my point is I worry less about jobs in absolute terms, and I worry more about the adaptation and control and the skills that we all have to cope with the world of AI. And I think one of the extraordinary things about this technology is the impact it has on other technologies. It's an enabling technology for so many things. So it has an impact on, for example, the speed at which you can discover new drugs. You can have an extraordinary period of advance in medical and life sciences technologies, which is AI enabled, for example. And you can repeat that process in industry after industry. So just to give one picture of the speed at which this is happening, Apple and Microsoft are no slouches, but you can see there NVIDIA, the world's most valuable company now, coming up from a very low base and overtaking them both. NVIDIA makes the chips that power a lot of AI. So this shows you just how dramatic this shift is. You've heard about the market wobbles now happening in America, but they're not going to reverse the huge shifts that you've seen here. There could be a correction, but this broad picture shows just how powerful the AI economy has become. And it leads into this final huge trend, which is just the speed at which life is changing and the economy is changing and the world is changing now. And businesses are going to have to live and cope with a world of turbocharged change. I've used Elon Musk there, the cover showing him as an illustration of this because he's involved in so many different elements of it, and of course he embraces it. So we have an age of revolutions, the internet, the pandemic, now AI, and it means that things that didn't seem possible before suddenly become not just possible but inevitable. And AI might not be, or is almost certain not to be, the last of these revolutions. Quantum computing is probably the next one that's coming up very fast and could have also very, very dramatic implications. So watch out for that one as well. So what does all this add up to? I was wanting to talk a little bit about the risks and the opportunities that come out of this very big picture for today. So this is a cover of The Economist that we had just very recently, the coming debt emergency, which is talking about the accumulation of debt around the world actually, but most of the rich economies are experiencing a version of this. And we seem politically not very adept at bringing this under control. So, how will this, if it's not sustainable, something's got to give, and that something quite conceivably could be over time inflation. If politicians can't take the hard decisions to bring the debt under control, maybe they let it inflate away. That could happen gradually, or it could happen fast, but that's got to be one of the possibilities. It could be that would be accompanied by a slowdown or recession, although I have to say that so far the world has been remarkably resilient to recession. Stock market correction, who knows whether the little jitters we see in the tech stocks turns into something bigger, but that's always a possibility, and we've heard some very big figures like Jamie Dimon warning that the market is perhaps overheated, needs to have a correction or will have a correction at some point, but he's not stupid enough to, and certainly as a journalist, I wouldn't be a journalist if I could tell you exactly when that point would be. And then there's what I call Fortress America. So, America has surrounded itself now with high tariff walls, much higher than before. It's also surrounded itself with big protections against immigrants, protections against even foreign students coming in. One worry is that over time, this will erode some of the competitive strengths that America has had for many years, the stimulus that comes from international competition and open markets, that will be somewhat less, and therefore America will be somewhat less dynamic than it would otherwise be without these protective walls around it. So I think that's a real possibility. Here's just, by the way, I wanted to show the dramatic build-up of debt. It's a sort of chart that kind of says it all. Again, a very long-run chart which shows that the world is in a period of historically high debt. These are the advanced economies. The gross government debt is a share of GDP, and you can see that it's really reached above 100%. That's seriously high, and the politicians, as I mentioned, not exactly grasping this particular nettle with alacrity. So those are the risks. I wanted to talk about the opportunities as well. This was a rather alarming cover, looking where we talked about the economics of AI, if you like, and come on to that in a second. But I think it's pretty clear to me that America, despite perhaps some of the policies that are making that may over time erode some of its dynamism, America is going to remain number one, extraordinary dynamic economy, and as you were hearing earlier on, don't underestimate the strength, don't bet against the strength of the American economy. It is, the American consumer is a wondrous thing to behold, seems to drive growth remarkably over years. It's not going to be an entirely smooth ride, that's always going to be the case, but it's very deeply ingrained, and there's a lot of power behind that. There's a fundamental thinking big in America, which helps drive it forward, thinking big about investment, thinking big about opportunities, and awareness of the need to be number one and to do what it takes to be and remain number one in critical areas. And American businesses are very tough. They just are. They're extremely resilient. And that's a very potent thing as well. So to take this turbocharged growth, to take this cover image here, is a real question. What impact does AI have on growth? What is the potential here? And so if you go back, as our cover story here did, and looked at the historical record, the world was lucky if, again, taking a very long view, until about 1700, the world economy would grow by about 8% every century, whole century. I mean, it wasn't dynamic, wouldn't excite markets today, right? But 8%, because there wasn't a technological revolution. It wasn't it was broadly pretty static. Population was growing slowly. That would, and occasionally there would be plagues that would wipe that growth out anyway. But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and the next 300 years, which people living back then would have been astonished by what happened. The economy grew by about 350% per century. So a dramatic change compared with what happened before, and it was of course accompanied by these huge growth in population that I talked about earlier. And there are people who say that attach the economy to AI becoming as efficient or even more efficient than human brain power at many tasks, and you start to get turbocharged growth at a rate that might be unthinkable even for today, after we've experienced historically high growth of 350% per century. There was one estimate, and this is just one estimate, this is not a prediction, but that talks of 20% per year growth if you get AIs being human level or above in 30% of tasks. Don't take that literally, but take that as a sort of example of orders of magnitude that people are even starting to imagine today. for growth. So there's enormous potential here that is frankly quite hard to get the mind around, and it's both a mixture. You can't quite tell whether this image is excited or scared by this. I think it's a little bit of both. And then if you go back from this huge potential to the more immediate, we heard about it earlier, interest rates coming down. This is the chart of my colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit, their forecast for interest rate cuts. They're seeing them going rather faster than the consensus forecast or the Fed's own projections. But you can see the trend, interest rates coming down, which is obviously encouraging for growth in the years ahead. And then this is a few key indicators, and you can see a sort of reasonably benign picture for this is the United States. GDP growth looking benign. The one kind of flashing sign there is the one that I've talked about, the government balance, the percentage of GDP, which is negative and quite alarmingly high, and that is, I think, the danger sign to be looking out for in the years ahead. We're in a period now of the longest government shutdown in American history. You can see that this is perhaps one sign of the battles to come over budgets, and it's probably a skirmish as to what you might see in the years ahead. So this was a cover we had, which is the one I want to leave you with. Actually, this was one we had before the last election, which is the US economy being the envy of the world. And there's always a little bit of a disconnect, perhaps, by what people see in their own country and how things look from outside. In your own country, up close, you tend to focus on the problems, that things are going wrong. But seen from outside America, it has enviable dynamism, had in the previous administration, has under this administration. I think America is going to continue to be the envy of the world in the years ahead, as it navigates and becomes an increasingly powerful player along with China in this extraordinary period of mega change that we're going to be living through in the decades ahead. Thank you very much.